We looked like fools, all right. But we were also victims of deceit, said John F. Kennedy, the 33rd President of the United States, reflecting on the Bay of Pigs invasion. This event stands as a stark reminder of Cold War hubris and miscalculation. The ill-fated attempt to overthrow Fidel Castro's Cuban government in April 1961 shook the world. It plunged the United States into a foreign policy crisis, solidified Castro's grip on power, and pushed Cuba further into the Soviet sphere. Conceived in secrecy and fueled by anti-communist fervor, the invasion was ultimately doomed by flawed assumptions and poor execution. Authorized by President Dwight D. Eisenhower and carried out under President Kennedy, it involved a brigade of Cuban exiles, trained and funded by the CIA. Their goal was to incite a popular uprising against Castro, but the operation ended in disaster, heightening tensions between the US and the USSR. The seeds of the Bay of Pigs invasion were sown in the early days of Fidel Castro's Cuban Revolution. Castro's rise to power in 1959, toppling the US-backed dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista, sent shockwaves through Washington. Deeply entrenched in Cold War anxieties, the Eisenhower administration viewed Castro's communist leanings and nationalization policies as a threat to U.S. interests in the region. Under Eisenhower's directive, the CIA began training Cuban exiles in Guatemala. These exiles, disgruntled by Castro's regime, were organized into a paramilitary force called Brigade 2506. Their plan was to launch a surprise invasion, seize control of a strategic location on the Cuban coast, and trigger a popular uprising against Castro. However, the invasion was plagued by miscalculations from the outset. The CIA overestimated anti-Castro sentiment within Cuba and underestimated the strength of Castro's military forces. Relying heavily on secrecy and surprise, and assuming that the United States could deny any involvement, the CIA believed the Cuban people would rise up to support the invaders. This assumption proved fatal. Launched on April 17, 1961, the invasion was met with fierce resistance from Cuban forces. The element of surprise was lost. The expected uprising never materialized, and the invading force, outnumbered and outgunned, was quickly overwhelmed. Within 72 hours, the invasion was crushed, with over 1,000 exiles captured and many killed or executed. The Bay of Pigs invasion unfolded as a series of blunders and miscalculations. The landing site, a remote beach known as Playa Girón, was poorly chosen, offering little natural cover for the invading force. Air support, crucial for the success of the operation, was inadequate. President Kennedy, facing mounting pressure from his advisors, had scaled back the planned airstrikes at the last minute, fearing that direct U.S. military involvement would provoke a wider conflict with the Soviet Union. Despite its small size, the Cuban Air Force proved surprisingly effective, sinking several ships carrying crucial supplies for the invaders. Without adequate air cover and supplies, the Exile Brigade was left stranded and vulnerable, facing relentless attacks from Cuban troops and militia. They fought bravely but were hopelessly outmatched. The invasion's failure was evident within hours, and the hoped-for uprising never materialized. Far from welcoming the invaders as liberators, the Cuban people rallied around Castro. The Bay of Pigs invasion sent shockwaves across the globe. The United States, long regarded as a beacon of democracy and freedom, was condemned for its blatant attempt to overthrow a sovereign government. The Soviet Union, eager to exploit the situation to its advantage, denounced the invasion as an act of aggression and pledged their unwavering support for Castro. The invasion had the opposite effect of what the United States had intended. It solidified Castro's grip on power and pushed Cuba further into the Soviet orbit. The incident also heightened Cold War tensions, bringing the world closer to the brink of nuclear war. Additionally, the crisis had profound implications for Latin America, fueling anti-American sentiment and strengthening the resolve of revolutionary movements across the region. Castro's Cuba, a nation forged in crisis, the Bay of Pigs, invasion was a defining moment for Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. The victory against the US-backed invaders solidified Castro's image as a national hero. It bolstered his legitimacy, both domestically and on the world stage. The invasion also deepened Castro's distrust of the United States. It reinforced his belief that Cuba needed to strengthen its ties with the Soviet Union for protection. In the aftermath of the invasion, Castro moved swiftly to consolidate his power. He formally declared Cuba a socialist state. He aligned the country even more closely with the Soviet Union. This alliance would have far-reaching consequences. It would lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis just a year later. The Bay of Pigs invasion had a profound impact on Cuban society. It fostered a siege mentality. It led to the suppression of dissent. It also fueled a deep-seated resentment towards the United States. The Kennedy administration, a legacy tarnished. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a major foreign policy disaster for the newly inaugurated Kennedy administration. It not only tarnished Kennedy's image, but also raised serious questions about his judgment and leadership. Initially hesitant, Kennedy ultimately went along with the recommendations of his advisors, a decision he would later regret deeply. Taking full responsibility for the fiasco, the debacle significantly impacted his approach to foreign policy. It made him more cautious in dealing with Cold War crises and led him to distrust the advice of the military and intelligence communities. From this hard lesson, Kennedy learned to shape his foreign policy cautiously for the rest of his presidency. Echoes of the past. Lessons unlearned. The Bay of Pigs. Invasion serves as a cautionary tale about the perils of covert operations, the dangers of Cold War thinking, and the critical importance of sound intelligence and decision-making. The invasion's failure was a product of numerous factors, including flawed assumptions, poor planning, inadequate intelligence, and a lack of clear objectives. The United States failed to grasp the complexities of the Cuban Revolution and underestimated the support for Castro among the Cuban people. The invasion plan was based on the flawed assumption that a small group of exiles could overthrow a well-established government. Furthermore, the operation was hampered by secrecy and deception, which prevented effective coordination and communication. The Bay of Pigs invasion holds important lessons for contemporary foreign policy, highlighting the dangers of unilateral interventionism, the importance of understanding local contexts, and the need for transparency and accountability in government decision-making. The Bay of Pigs invasion, a stain on history. The Bay of Pigs invasion remains a contentious and controversial event in history. It stands as a stark reminder of the Cold War's folly and the dangers of unchecked ambition. The invasion's legacy continues to shape relations between the United States and Cuba and serves as a cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of foreign intervention. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a costly failure that resulted in the loss of life, damaged the reputation of the United States, and ironically, strengthened the very regime it sought to overthrow. Its legacy continues to resonate today, reminding us of the enduring importance of diplomacy, multilateralism, and respect for international law.